Good morning. Before we begin with the message, I just want to give you two heads up. Today, or this weekend more accurately, we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Haiti mission in this church. Yesterday was the 40th day, or the 40th year point. But we really want to have a big celebration, and we'd like it with everybody present. So the Mission Council has already talked about this, and we look forward to a time maybe this spring when we might gather together with a big dinner and a full celebration of this important milestone. So we'll let you know when that becomes a possibility, but just keep it in mind. Today is just a foretaste of what we hope in the near future. Also, another special treat we have today, immediately following this worship service, there will be a video by our former senior pastor, Harley Dixon, who was the senior pastor here when the Haiti mission began. You'll want to stay tuned for that right after the service. It will be preceded by some photos, some special photos that you'll want to see of Bill and Alice White, and it will also be followed by some other photos of our mission. So, as I say, please be sure to continue watching after the conclusion of the worship service. Would you pray with me now, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. God's call upon our lives has an interesting reciprocal nature to it. Let me repeat that. God's call upon our lives has an interesting reciprocal nature to it. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as with God's grace, which comes first before any response we might make back toward God with our love and faith, so it's true that when we decide to give our lives in service to the Lord, it's preceded by God's action. Now, by service, I don't mean just serving the Lord as an ordained or licensed pastor, whether an elder or deacon. I'm talking about any commitment any of us makes, laity or clergy, that we choose to make toward God, any commitment. That promise, that vow, that turning toward God in heart and mind, engaging in a new level or kind of Christian service or devotion does not occur in a vacuum. I believe it follows some action or movement on the part of God first that inspires us. It's reciprocal. Take today's gospel lesson from Matthew 14, for example. What is it that starts that story? Did the disciples decide to hop in the boat and take a pleasure cruise across the Sea of Galilee? No. After Jesus had performed the amazing miracle of feeding the 5,000 men plus women and children, Matthew says immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds and then went up to a mountain to pray. Jesus directed their actions, and he sent them across the lake. In other words, he put them in the position to experience what followed. Everything that happened later that night was only because Jesus first got his followers to step into the boat and sail to the other side of the lake. By the way, I'm referring to this body of water as a lake because it really is. The Sea of Galilee is a fairly large lake, about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. I looked it up. Lake Norman is 33 and a half miles long and 9 miles wide at its widest, meaning it's bigger than the Sea of Galilee. In spite of its relatively moderate size, though, the Sea of Galilee can experience some fierce storms. When I visited the Holy Land some years back, I learned that because of the configuration of the mountains surrounding the Sea of Galilee, storms such as portrayed in today's scripture can and often do suddenly appear where the wind gets funneled because of those mountains and comes rushing down onto the lake with great force. Our boat captain, when we were on the Sea of Galilee, told us that he had experienced 10-foot waves on occasion. Now imagine the effect of such large waves on a small boat as the one the disciples were in that night. So Jesus told the disciples to go across the lake. It wasn't the first time Jesus took the initiative. As Will Willimon points out, Jesus didn't usually wait for others to come to him. In Matthew's gospel, after he began preaching, Jesus, walking beside this same Sea of Galilee, noticed two pairs of brothers fishing, and he invited them to follow him. He called them. He would also call Matthew, a tax collector, to follow him and become his disciple. These men didn't go first looking for Jesus, according to this gospel. Jesus sought them. And then he would send them away out into the world. While still in training as disciples, as students, they were sent out, making them apostles. That's the meaning of that word, those who are sent. He sent them out to the lost sheep of Israel, proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven was near, and to heal the sick, raise the dead, and drive out demons. This is a lot for new followers of Jesus to be doing. When Jesus comes looking for you, beware, because he's not likely calling you to a life of leisure. In fact, he's probably calling you to stretch yourself and to do what you never imagined doing, and to go where you never dreamed of going. You know, there's a story about a man standing at the pearly gates. Have you ever done anything of particular merit? St. Peter asks. This joke seems to be a better Roman Catholic, would be better suited for a Roman Catholic audience maybe than a Protestant gathering, with works righteousness. But anyway, the man says, well, I can think of one thing. Once I came upon a gang of really tough bikers who were threatening a young woman. I told them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen. So I approached the largest and most heavily tattooed biker. I smacked him on the head, kicked his bike over, ripped out his nose ring and threw it to the ground and told them, leave her alone or you'll answer to me. St. Peter was impressed and asked, when did this happen? A couple of minutes ago. If you're not laughing yet, you're going to soon, trust me. Jesus is not likely to call us to that level of sacrifice. But he does call us to expand our horizons, to stretch ourselves in service to the kingdom. But first, he must get our attention for us to be able to hear his call. That's what happened in today's gospel lesson. Jesus sends the disciples across the lake at night. Terrible storm comes up, battering the boat with wind and waves, stranding the disciples in the middle of the lake. They must have been exhausted and at their wits' end, pulling the oars hopelessly against this headwind for hours. Somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., that's the fourth watch according to the original Greek, that's a Roman measurement of time, Jesus suddenly appears walking on the water. Now, they don't know what to make of this sight. They think they're seeing a ghost, and they cry out in fear. It's interesting that some commentators go on about the traditional belief of that time that the waters of the world represented chaos or evil, so that the disciples saw the roiling sea as a battle between heaven and the forces of evil. That may be true, but I have a much simpler explanation. They were scared to death because the wind and the waves were threatening to capsize their boat, and they thought they were seeing a ghost. Who wouldn't be scared under those circumstances? Now, realizing their fear, Jesus identifies himself and tells them not to be afraid. Easier said than done. Peter, true to form, speaks up and says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. As several commentators point out, this is a rather odd thing to say under the circumstances. You'd more likely expect him to say something like, Lord, if that's you, please calm this storm, just like you did that time before when we were all in the boat together. But he doesn't. Michael Turner makes an interesting suggestion. He says that Peter's request grows out of his wanting to be a good and true disciple of Jesus. Disciples or students or followers, he says, wanted to do what their teacher did and to walk as their teacher walked, and so as to be just like their teacher. Peter was trying to be an A-plus disciple and imitate Jesus, even walking on water as he was doing. But, and this is important, Peter also realizes that outrageous act would only be possible if Jesus made it possible. So he asks Jesus to command him to do it. Makes me think about perhaps Peter was remembering God commanding or calling into being at the original creation, light and darkness and so forth. God speaks it, and it is. So if Jesus speaks it, it will be. If Jesus commands him, he will be able to walk on the water. And so Peter asks Jesus to do this for him. Then and only then would he be able to walk on the water. So Jesus gives him what he asks for, and he tells him to come to him. And so Peter does the unthinkable, and he gets out of the boat. I can imagine what the other disciples must have been thinking and wondering as they watched him go over the edge. He gets out of the boat and he walks toward Jesus right on top of the water. That is, until he takes his eye off of Jesus and he notices the strong wind blowing instead. He may have also looked down and realized, I'm standing on water. Either way, he stops focusing on Jesus. And when that happens, he gets scared and he starts to sink until Jesus grabs him and saves him. Why so little faith? Jesus asks Peter. Why so much doubt? Jesus helps Peter back into the boat and joins him there, and then the wind suddenly stops. As I said earlier, God gets our attention first before we respond to God's calling. Jesus, walking on the water, caught the eye of the disciples, especially Peter, who was suddenly inspired to take this bold step, this giant leap, if you will, of getting out of the boat. Something grabbed Peter inside and unlocked faith enough to take that big step, drawing him out of the boat and closer to Jesus physically and spiritually. Yes, he had doubts. Yes, he got scared when he focused on the wrong thing, on the wind rather than on Jesus. But Peter got out of the boat, unlike any of the other disciples. That's the important lesson from today's scripture that I believe should guide us this morning. This weekend, as we've already mentioned, we mark the 40th anniversary of when someone else in our time and in this church got out of the boat, another boat, that is. Something happened to Bill White 40 years ago, leading him to stretch himself, and as I said, to do what I'm sure he never imagined doing himself, and to go where he never dreamed of going, and that was to Haiti. Bill was a successful businessman and a member of our church in 1980, along with his wife Alice. They also owned a horse farm here in South Charlotte. Bill also owned a 50-foot sailboat with twin diesel engines that was named the Pieces of Eight, which was moored in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and which Bill and his family enjoyed for sailing, fishing, and excursions for 10 years. But then on Christmas Eve, 1979, he announced to his stunned family that he was getting out of the boat, those are my words, not his, and giving it to the United Methodist Church. Without realizing it at the time, Bill was kicking off the Haiti mission of this congregation that's been going on for 4 decades and counting. A series of events followed that resulted in the boat and this church being directed to Haiti and its people, which the Reverend Harley Dixon, senior pastor of Providence UMC at the time, has, as I mentioned earlier, has chronicled with such wonderful detail in his book, The Real Miracle. I know many of you have read that wonderful book. Similar to the disciples being told by Jesus to cross the Sea of Galilee in their boat, Bill was soon asked by the executive director of UMCOR, that's the United Methodist Committee on Relief, to deliver the Pieces of Eight to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Bill didn't even know where Port-au-Prince was at the time, but he agreed to make the 1,600-mile voyage, even though it wasn't the safest thing to do, because in August of 1980, when this would take place, there were hurricanes tracking across the Atlantic Ocean toward the Caribbean. There were all kinds of drug-running pirates raiding small boats in that area, and he would be hugging the coastline of Cuba. Thankfully, Bill fared better than the fellow I told you about who met up with the tough biker gang. Harley's book captures this excerpt from the ship's log along with a supplemental note by Alice. Listen to what it says. On August the 8th, 1980, a boat called the Pieces of Eight sailed into the Atlantic, and unbeknownst to anyone then, she launched a mission as well. Congratulations, because we're now one day into the 5th decade of the Haiti mission launched that day. Bill White didn't realize it at the time, although his ship captain's log would later reflect that when he first sighted land off of the coast of Haiti, he remarked, "There's something about Haiti. There is something there." In late December 1980, Alice White made her first trip to Haiti by plane. She, like her husband, was quickly and deeply moved by this country and its beautiful and resilient people. Hunger and poor health were two predominant challenges the people of Haiti were facing, though. As to the former, the idea arose of using the pieces of aid as a fishing boat by Haitians to help them become more self-sufficient in feeding themselves. This plan ultimately did not work for a number of reasons, but the proceeds from the eventual sale of the boat went toward building a clinic in Haiti, thus helping to address the second challenge. Something else also happened that led to the construction of a much-needed health clinic in northern Haiti. Other persons got out of the boat, so to speak. There was already a hunger here in this church for missions. There was from the start. That's part of our DNA. That's how we were formed. In early 1982, Bill White shared his dreams for Haiti with members of PUMC. And the church mission committee, chaired by Al Rose at the time, decided to earmark some of the previous Christmas Eve special offering funds for Haiti. We were hooked, no pun intended. That December, a group of 11 church members were flying down to Haiti for what's now referred to as the Look-See mission. They looked, they saw, and the rest is history. These members of our church had gotten out of the boat, and many, many, many have followed since then. I spoke the other day with Carolyn Boylan. She and her husband Howard were on that Look-See mission, and many other trips later. Their connection, again, pardon the pun, to Haiti was a pair of jumper cables. They were new to Providence at the time, and they heard about the plans for the boat to Haiti and how they wanted to fix it up and be able to use it for fishing and how they needed some heavy-duty jumper cables. So Howard went to Sears to buy some, and then when he brought them to the church, he was told, well, you need to bring them down to the White's horse farm. So he did, and he got to talking with Bill and Alice, who got him acquainted with Haiti. Carolyn was charged with the idea too. I'm really bad about these puns. She told me, "You never know how the Lord will use you." You never know how the Lord will use you. How true indeed. Al and Helen Rose were on that Look-See mission trip too. Helen got terribly sick one day, so ill that she felt as though she were going to die. And they were painting a medical clinic in La Saline and decided to place her on an examining table because of her acute nausea. To avoid splattering paint on her, they draped a sheet over her, which made her feel even more that she was going to die, and she looked the part. You know, I was talking to Al the other day, and he laughs a lot when he tells this story about his wife, probably more than is good for him, I'm just saying. In Harley Dixon's book, Al is quoted regarding the struggle of sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with persons who are hungry and hurting, concluding that those basic needs have to be addressed before the other message of hope will be heard. Al talked to me about the joy of being part of this mission to Haiti. No one is out to receive any medals, he said. They just feel led by God to do what they should do. Hear that? They felt led by God to do what they should do. As I said at the outset, Jesus doesn't just wait on us. He comes to us and calls us to him, and then he directs us out of the boat. You know, I was curious about the name of the boat that started all of this. So yesterday I looked up online what pieces of 8 were. They were Spanish silver coins common in the American colonies before the colonies had their own monetary systems or could issue currency. Now here's the interesting part. To make change, these coins were cut up into 8 pieces resembling pieces of a pie. By the way, that's also where the nickname for American quarters came from, 2 bits. 2 bits or pieces of the coin would be 1/4 or 1/4 of the whole coin. Anyway, I got to thinking about the boat, the pieces of 8, and how it was subdivided, in a sense, into many other missions, all arising from the original. The boat was sold, and its proceeds led our church to help fund and build the Tovar Clinic, which continues to this day as the longest-running medical mission in the United Methodist Church. doctors and nurses from this congregation and from other churches all around us were inspired to give of their time and their talents over the years at the Tovar Clinic. Wells became a major focus of our church's mission early on in Haiti and continued to be. In third world countries, typically the water supply is not safe to drink. Cholera is always a concern. By last count, I believe that our church has funded 42 wells providing clean and safe drinking water to persons in Haiti, and with other partners along with us, inspired by our work and working with us, well over 100. I don't know what the total would be at this stage. We've supported education in the Cap-Haitian area through a school as well as with scholarship help. We helped make it possible for a young woman, Tashiline, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, from Don Don, to attend nursing school. Now think about the impact of that action on countless lives going forward. How many lives will be saved because of her training as a nurse through this scholarship? We also help make much needed medical supplies available, making sure that they're sent from the U.S. to Haiti through our financial support of the Haiti Mission Foundation of Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a nonprofit organization that grew out of our church's Haiti mission. And more recently, we've been supporting Dr. Eugene, actually for years now, in many, many ways, including in helping with the construction of the New Hope Hospital in Plain du Nord outside of Cap-Haitian, where he's the medical director. Many of you know, and many of you don't know, that his very life was saved through the efforts of some in this church not that long ago. Again, think of the long-term impact of those efforts on countless others in the years ahead. And one of the most growth-producing pieces of aid is our microcredit loan program to women in northern Haiti. The women who are participating in this loan program, last year I think there were 388 active microloans, have an incredible high rate of repayment of the loans. And they use their earnings not just for themselves, but for the benefit of their families. They have these small businesses, something as small as like selling chickens sometimes. But those businesses produce enough income that they can help their families. A lot of times getting their children to go to school because of it, feeding their families. It's amazing the positive impact. Unfortunately, we found that men don't seem to be as careful about using the money for their families. And so that's why we are focusing on women, because it maximizes the impact on the people of Haiti multi-generationally. Again, think about the tremendous ongoing changing of lives that takes place because of this investment. Each one of those pieces of 8 are magnified in their impact. It's really, truly remarkable when you think about the 40-year mission of this church to Haiti and the number of lives changed, saved, and otherwise touched by the members of this congregation, and most importantly, by the love of Christ through them. Harley Dixon, at the end of his book, tells what the real miracle is that led him to give it that title. He writes, "The real miracle is a love that compels volunteers to share their love with brothers and sisters in Haiti. People often forgotten, sometimes undeserving, who don't always appreciate what is done in their behalf, but who are loved anyway. The real miracle is not in numbers healed or in missions accomplished. It is in the faithfulness of those who share their love in Haiti, for better or worse, in success or failure, taking on the form of a servant and helping in a practical way." Peter, along with the other disciples called by Jesus, wasn't gifted with specialized skills that made him an expert apostle. In fact, he seemed to have some personality quirks and weaknesses that you could say made him less qualified. But he did have one very important quality that made him an apostle and the rock. And that was faith enough to get out of the boat. All of the members of this church who have given of their time and talent and treasure, beginning with Bill and Alice White, in support of the Haiti mission, have shown similar faith and willingness to get out of the boat. And that same faith, by all of us, will sail this great ministry forward into its 5th decade, and God willing, far beyond that. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.